He dug a hole in his backyard, thinking he would find only dirt. But what had been hidden under the soil for decades turned out to be so shocking that it changed his life forever. Subscribe and write where you're watching this video from. The desert sun always carried with it a quiet heaviness, a kind of weight that seemed to stretch time itself, and for Marcus, that feeling was both unsettling and strangely comforting. He had not expected his life to lead him here, to this quiet corner of Arizona, but after years of hard labor, restless nights, and the grind and pull of disappointment, he had longed for nothing more than silence. Silence, and perhaps a patch of earth to call his own. His new house was not remarkable by any means, a single-story structure built decades earlier. Its paint faded by years of relentless sun, the roof a little uneven in places, the porch creaking with each step. And yet, to Marcus, it was a sanctuary. He had bought it cheaply, far more cheaply than anyone might have guessed, and even though he knew the reason was the house's age and its long list of needed repairs, he could not shake the sense that he had stumbled upon something meant for him. For as long as Marcus could remember, he had carried the burden of survival more than the dream of living. He had grown up in a working-class family, the kind where every dollar mattered, and where the thought of homeownership seemed like some far-off horizon, meant for people who belonged to a different world. His father had spent his life hauling crates at warehouses, his mother in the kitchens of diners that smelled perpetually of grease and coffee. Marcus had followed in those footsteps. Construction sites, loading docks, shifts that stretched into nights, and an endless cycle of exhaustion that wore down not only the body, but the soul. Yet, through it all, he kept a kind of stubbornness, a belief that if he worked long enough, if he saved enough, one day there would be a turning point. This house, small and worn, was that turning point. The first days in his new home were marked by a kind of reverence. He moved carefully through the rooms, dusting, painting, replacing what was broken with his own hands. The neighbors, though reserved, offered polite nods when he passed, but Marcus felt no need to intrude upon their lives. For the first time, he could breathe. He would sit on the porch in the evening with a glass of water and watch as the horizon burned into shades of orange and red, the desert breathing with its slow rhythm, cicadas humming in the distance. Here, no one asked more of him than what he was willing to give. He dreamed of planting a garden in the back. The backyard, though overgrown with weeds and patches of dry soil, held promise. Marcus imagined neat rows of tomatoes, peppers, and leafy greens, growing strong under the Arizona sun. It would be work, but work he welcomed, for it was different from the relentless demands of employers. This would be his labor, his hands shaping life from the earth, and the thought filled him with a satisfaction he hadn't known in years. In that garden, he saw not only vegetables, but a metaphor for his own renewal. What had once been barren could become fruitful. What had once been tired could begin again. Each morning, he rose early, the air still cool before the sun gained its fury, and stood in the backyard surveying the ground. The soil was uneven, packed down from neglect. The remnants of old roots twisted here and there, a stubborn resistance to change. Yet, Marcus smiled at the challenge. He fetched his tools, an old shovel he had carried with him from job to job, a pickaxe bought from a thrift store, a wheelbarrow with rust along its rim. They were not new, not shiny, but like him, they had endured. On the first day of digging, he felt something close to joy. The sweat beaded quickly on his brow, his arms strained with the effort, but every scoop of earth lifted seemed to lighten a part of his heart. He thought of how his father once told him that work in the land gave a man peace. though his father himself had never had the chance to own more than a rented plot of grass. Marcus intended to honor that memory in his own way. He dug steadily, humming to himself, pausing now and then to wipe the grit from his forehead. Birds circled overhead, their shadows slipping across the ground, while the distant sound of traffic from the highway reminded him faintly that he was not entirely cut off from the world. The days blended together as he worked, clearing weeds, loosening soil, shaping the outline of what would be his small garden. He thought often of meals to come, fresh salads, stews seasoned with herbs he could grow himself, the taste of food he had pulled from the earth with his own hands. He imagined inviting his mother to visit, showing her the rows of plants, seeing pride in her eyes that her son had managed what his father never could. These thoughts spurred him forward, even as the ground seemed harder than he anticipated, even as his back ached from bending and lifting. It was in the midst of this steady rhythm of digging that his life took its first unexpected turn. The moment came without warning. The shovel struck something solid, the sound sharp and metallic, a jarring echo that did not belong to rock or root. Marcus froze, leaning on the handle, listening to the reverberation fade. At first, he assumed it was nothing more than a buried pipe, some forgotten remnant of the house's age, but the sound had been too wide, too hollow. His curiosity stirred, a subtle shift in the air around him as though the earth itself was whispering. He pressed the shovel down again, scraping across the surface. More metal. Not a small object, but something broad, spreading beneath the soil. His pulse quickened. He crouched, brushing away dirt with his hands, feeling the roughness of corroded iron or steel beneath his fingers. The thought of striking something valuable or dangerous flickered across his mind. Pipes could burst, tanks could leak. He hesitated, the shovel paused in his grip, and for a moment he considered leaving it. But the question had already planted itself in his mind, and Marcus was not a man who could ignore such a question once it had taken root. He cleared more earth, each movement slower now, deliberate. The sunlight glared down, the heat pressing against his shoulders, but he felt none of it. His focus was on the emerging shape, the outline of a surface too even, too deliberate to be natural. What lay beneath his backyard? Why had no one mentioned it? The idea unsettled him, but it also pulled him closer, like a tide he could not resist. By the time evening fell, he had uncovered enough to see that it was not a simple pipe or discarded object. It was larger, flat, like a sealed door, its edges disappearing back into the soil. Exhausted, Marcus leaned back, staring at it, the dusk shadows stretching long across the yard. His garden, his peaceful plan for a quiet life, had already transformed into something else entirely. A seed of mystery had been planted in place of his vegetables, and whether he wanted it or not, it had already begun to grow. That night, as he sat on the porch, watching the stars climb the sky, he tried to shake the feeling that the house, the land itself, had been waiting for him. Waiting for someone with a shovel, someone stubborn enough to dig, someone unwilling to turn away once the surface had been struck. Marcus could not have known how profoundly this chance discovery would alter the course of his life. For now, he only knew that the silence he had sought had been broken, and in its place lay a question buried in metal and earth, demanding to be answered. The next morning dawned with the same brilliance that always seemed to accompany the desert sky, a canvas of soft pinks and deep oranges fading into pale blue. Marcus woke early, his body sore from the previous day's work, but his mind restless, buzzing with images of the strange surface he had uncovered. He had gone to bed thinking of neat garden rows, But sleep had only delivered uneasy dreams of hidden doors and buried chambers, dreams in which he stood at the edge of something vast and unknowable, reaching out his hand only to wake before he could touch it. The metallic surface in his backyard was no longer a simple curiosity. It was a weight in his chest, a demand that would not be ignored. He dressed quickly and went outside, shovel in hand, his steps purposeful. The early air was still cool, the sun not yet fierce, but already his pulse quickened with anticipation. The spot where he had left off was marked by the dark square of exposed metal, its edges still lost beneath the soil. Marcus crouched beside it and brushed at the dirt with his fingers, the grit catching beneath his nails. The sound of his breath filled the silence, steady and uneven, as though the very act of touching it pulled something deep within him into motion. At first, he told himself again that it might be nothing. An old cistern, perhaps, or a septic tank, something mundane that had been forgotten in the history of the house. But as his shovel bit into the ground around the edges, lifting and peeling away layers of dry earth, the size of the object revealed itself. It was not a small obstruction. The surface stretched wider and wider, too large for any ordinary utility fixture. The dull clang of metal meeting metal echoed each time he tapped against it, and each echo seemed to stir his imagination further. Sweat dripped down his temple as the hours passed, the sun now rising high overhead, baking the soil into dust. Marcus barely noticed the discomfort. His shirt clung to his back, his muscles burned from the effort, but the pull of discovery kept him steady. The square began to emerge more fully, its shape unmistakably deliberate. The corners were too sharp, the edges too precise. It was no accident of nature, nor a careless piece of trash buried long ago. This was something constructed, something placed with intention. By mid-afternoon, Marcus stood over what appeared to be the full outline of a massive plate, its rusted surface rough and pitted from time, but still solid, unyielding. He dropped his shovel and crouched low again, tracing the edges with his hands, feeling the coldness of the metal beneath the desert heat. The contrast struck him. While everything around him burned under the relentless sun, this object held its chill as though it belonged to another world hidden just beneath the thin skin of his yard. Questions rose and circled in his mind. Could it be some kind of storage container left behind by the previous owner? Could it be dangerous? The thought of buried chemicals, old fuel, or even explosives came to him in flashes, each more troubling than the last. But then another idea pressed forward, stubborn and unrelenting. What if it was treasure? Not treasure in the fantastical sense of gold and jewels, but something historical, something of value long forgotten. People had lived in this part of the desert for generations, and history had a way of leaving traces buried just out of sight. Marcus sat back in the dirt, his hands streaked with soil, his breathing heavy. He tried to recall whether the realtor or the previous owner had mentioned anything unusual about the property, but nothing came to mind. The house had been sold quickly, almost too easily, and Marcus had been so eager for a new beginning that he hadn't asked too many questions. Now he wondered if there had been a reason no one had stayed here for long. Despite the gnawing uncertainty, he could not stop himself from continuing. He fetched a bucket of water and poured it across the exposed surface, washing away the dust. The muddy water ran down into grooves and seams that confirmed his growing suspicion. It was not just a plate, it was a lid. There was a handle, barely visible, corroded and fused with time, but undeniably there. His heart raced at the sight of it. He stood over it, shovel still in hand, and felt the conflict churn inside him. One part of him screamed to leave it alone, to cover it back with soil, to pretend he had never found it. Another part urged him onward, insisting that answers lay just beneath, that this was not a discovery meant to be buried again. The silence of the yard pressed down on him, the wind whispering through dry weeds, the distant hum of insects filling the air. He felt like the only man in the world, standing on the threshold of something vast and unseen. Marcus lowered himself to the ground and pressed his ear against the metal. At first, there was nothing but the dull resonance of his own heartbeat. But then, faintly, he thought he heard an emptiness beneath, a hollow space waiting below. The realization sent a chill through him despite the heat. Whatever this was, it was not filled with dirt or rock. There was space down there, space that had been sealed away for who knew how long. The sun dipped lower as the hours slipped away, casting long shadows across the yard. Marcus leaned on his shovel, staring at the rusted handle, imagining what lay beneath. His garden had become secondary now, forgotten entirely. The dream of tomatoes and peppers was replaced by visions of secret rooms, of hidden pasts, of stories locked away beneath the earth. He felt the weight of responsibility pressing on him. If he was the first to uncover this, what would he do with it? Could he even manage what might come next? When, at last, he returned inside for the night, his body weary, his mind refused to rest. He replayed the clang of shovel against metal over and over, as though each strike had opened not just the ground, but a door in his imagination. He thought of his father again, the lessons of labor and perseverance, and wondered what advice he would give in this moment. Perhaps he would tell him to be cautious, to think before plunging ahead. But Marcus knew himself well enough to recognize that the choice had already been made. He would return tomorrow. He would clear more soil, and he would find a way to open that lid. Lying in bed, the ceiling above him lost in shadows, he realized that his life had shifted without his consent. He had come here searching for peace, for simplicity, but the earth had offered him a mystery instead. And though part of him longed to resist, he knew that he was already too far gone. The desert had chosen him, the shovel had struck, and the secret waiting beneath the ground would not let him go until it was revealed. By the time the next day arrived, Marcus felt as though he had crossed an invisible boundary. What had begun as a plan for a simple garden was now something altogether different, and every breath he drew seemed tied to the patch of earth where the metal plate rested, half uncovered, daring him to continue. He rose with the sun, but it was not the hopeful eagerness of a gardener that pushed him forward. It was the undeniable pull of the unknown. He carried his tools outside with steady determination, knowing that he could not let the mystery sit buried beneath a thin veil of dirt. The air was still cool, though already heavy with the promise of heat. Marcus returned to the object, crouching beside it, his hands brushing away the dried soil that clung stubbornly to the edges. The rusted handle, which he had revealed the day before, stood out like a wound in the center of the plate. He studied it closely, noting the deep corrosion that had fused it nearly shut, but the shape was unmistakable. It was not a random scrap of metal, not an accident of forgotten debris. It was a door. The thought struck him with finality, and he felt the tremor of it run through his chest. He worked carefully, scraping away more dirt, widening the area so that the edges of the plate stretched clearly before him. The shovel rang against the sides, each clang echoing in the stillness of the yard. Soon he could see that the door was not a simple square, but a circular hatch, its metal frame set deep into the ground, like a sealed mouth waiting to be pried open. The soil had preserved it in some ways, but the decades of neglect had taken their toll. Rust and decay clung to every seam, and the handle itself looked as though it might snap under pressure. Still, Marcus knew he had no choice but to try. He paused to wipe his brow, the sweat streaking his skin, and considered the dangers. What if it was nothing more than an old septic tank, filled with fumes that could choke him in seconds? What if he opened it and released something toxic into the air? The cautionary thoughts circled him, but he could not stop. Curiosity gnawed at him too deeply, demanding to know what lay hidden. He fetched a long iron bar from his shed, wedged it beneath the handle, and began to pull. At first, nothing happened, the hatch unmoving, the rust holding it shut like an ancient lock. He pressed harder, the veins in his arms straining, his teeth clenched with effort. The metal groaned, a long and grinding sound, and then with a sudden crack, the seal gave way. Marcus staggered back, nearly losing his balance as the hatch shifted slightly, a gap forming where none had existed before. A rush of stale air rose from below, heavy with the scent of mold, iron, and something older that he could not name. He coughed and pulled the neck of his shirt over his nose, waving his hand through the space as though that could banish decades of trapped air. Slowly, he lowered himself again, peering into the darkness that yawned beneath. At first, he saw nothing, only the black void that swallowed the daylight. Then, as his eyes adjusted, he caught the faint outline of something descending, a spiral staircase, its metal frame twisting down into shadows. His breath caught in his throat. This was no septic tank, no discarded relic of plumbing or utility. This was an entrance. For a long moment, Marcus simply stared, the image burning into his mind. The staircase was rusted, eaten by time, but it was still recognizable, each step a pale curve sinking deeper into the earth. He felt a shiver run along his spine despite the desert heat pressing against his back. The very existence of such a structure beneath his yard was impossible to reconcile with the life he had envisioned here. He had come seeking quiet, seeking a retreat from the chaos of the world, and now here was a door into a different kind of chaos altogether, a past that had lain dormant beneath his feet. He sat back on the dirt, his elbows on his knees, staring at the hatch and the dark mouth below it. Should he close it again, cover it, and pretend it had never been uncovered? The thought tempted him, for with it came the possibility of returning to the life he had planned, the rows of vegetables, the peace of solitude. But another thought rose with equal force. What if this was something extraordinary? What if this was a discovery that would never come again? To turn away now would be to deny not only his curiosity, but something larger, something that seemed to have chosen him. The evening fell around him, painting the sky in streaks of crimson and purple, and still he sat by the hatch. He lowered a small rock into the opening, listening as it clattered against the metal steps, the sound echoing before fading into silence. The depth was impossible to judge, but it was clear that the staircase led somewhere. He imagined rooms buried in the earth, chambers untouched by time, secrets locked away for decades. He imagined what it might feel like to be the first man in half a century, perhaps longer, to set foot there. The thought filled him with equal parts dread and exhilaration. As night gathered, Marcus closed the hatch again, the metal scraping against its frame, sealing the darkness away once more. He could not bring himself to leave it open, not yet, not until he was prepared. He returned inside his house, but his mind remained tethered to that circle of rusted iron, to the staircase waiting in the void. He ate without tasting, sat without resting, and when he finally lay down in bed, the image of the hatch hovered in his vision as though it had burned itself into the backs of his eyelids. Sleep, when it came, was fitful. He dreamed of descending those stairs, his footsteps echoing, the air growing colder, the walls closing in. He dreamed of voices whispering from the shadows, voices that seemed to belong to another era, speaking words he could not understand. He dreamed of reaching the bottom only to find another door, sealed tighter than the first, and of hands pressing against it from the other side. He woke with a start, his skin damp with sweat, his breath shallow. In the darkness of his bedroom, Marcus knew that the decision had already been made. He would return to the hatch. He would not rest until he had gone down those stairs and seen for himself what lay hidden beneath his yard. The garden could wait. Peace could wait. The unknown was calling, and he could no longer ignore it. The following morning, Marcus awoke with the unmistakable sense that the time for hesitation had passed. He had uncovered the hatch, had forced it open and glimpsed the spiral staircase coiling downward into darkness, and no matter how much fear coiled in his stomach, he knew he would not be able to return to his ordinary life without descending. The thought of closing it up forever and pretending it wasn't there had crossed his mind again and again during the restless night, but each time he imagined walking away, it left him hollow. The hatch had become more than a mystery buried beneath his backyard. It had become a command. He had discovered a door into the past, and doors were meant to be opened. The sun was only just rising when he stepped outside, the cool air fleeting against his skin before the desert day would once again turn merciless. His gaze fell immediately to the patch of earth in the yard, where the circle of rusted metal lay like an accusation. He crouched beside it, his hand brushing against the handle as though to reassure himself that it was real and not some fever dream conjured by exhaustion. The rust flaked at his touch, staining his fingertips red-brown, and he felt a tremor run through him. This was no dream. It was waiting for him, patient and unyielding. He knew instinctively that walking into such a place without preparation would be foolish. Years of labor had taught him caution, and though curiosity gnawed at him, it was tempered by the understanding that underground spaces could be treacherous. He remembered stories from his time on construction sites, men injured or worse when old foundations gave way or air turned poisonous, so he gathered what he thought might protect him. From the shed, he fetched a sturdy flashlight with fresh batteries, a coil of rope, an old canvas bag with water, and a mask he once used during demolition work. He even took the time to tie a second flashlight to his belt, telling himself that he would not be the man who ventured into the dark unprepared. When, at last, he pulled the hatch open again, the stale breath of the underground rose to meet him, heavy and damp. He coughed, tugging the mask over his mouth and nose, the fabric scratching against his skin. With the flashlight in hand, he leaned forward, shining its beam down into the shaft. The metal stairs gleamed faintly in the narrow cone of light, their edges eaten away by rust, each one looking as though it might crumble beneath the weight of a foot. The spiral wound downward, disappearing into blackness, and he could not see the bottom. The beam caught only fragments of wall, rough and concrete, stained with age. Marcus lowered the rope into the opening, securing it around a thick beam of the porch before testing its weight. He wasn't sure if he would need it, but the act itself gave him comfort. His pulse quickened as he placed his foot on the first step. The metal groaned softly, but it held. His grip on the railing was tight, his flashlight angled ahead of him, each movement deliberate. The air grew cooler with each step, carrying with it the scent of earth and decay. The silence was absolute, broken only by the creak of the staircase and the sound of his own breathing. The descent felt longer than it was. He counted his steps without meaning to, reaching 20, then 30, then losing track as the spiral seemed endless. His flashlight beam danced across the walls, revealing cracks in the concrete, spider webs, and stains of rust. Once he thought he saw movement, a shadow shifting out of reach of the light, but when he swung the beam back, there was nothing but empty wall. His heart raced, but he pressed on, unwilling to let fear turn him back now. At last, his boots touched solid ground. He stood at the base of the staircase, the flashlight sweeping over what lay before him, and his breath caught in awe. The space opened into a large chamber, a dome-shaped room that stretched farther than he expected. The walls curved upward into a ceiling lined with panels that looked like fiberglass, cracked and mottled with age. The ground beneath him was solid concrete, dust lying thick across its surface. The beam illuminated corners where old crates sat abandoned, their wood warped and split. Against one wall, a faded poster hung by a single nail, its edges curled, the image barely visible but unmistakably a relic of another time. Letters in bold block print, a slogan half lost to age but carrying the unmistakable air of propaganda. Marcus stepped forward, his footsteps echoing in the hollow space, each sound unnervingly loud. He swept his light across the room, catching sight of rusted metal canisters, empty shelves, and a table that had long since rotted into collapse. The silence pressed against him, heavy and watchful, as though the room itself remembered the weight of secrets it once held. He felt the hairs on his arms rise, not from cold, but from the sensation that he was trespassing in a place not meant to be disturbed. He crouched beside one of the crates, prying it open with the iron bar he had carried down with him. Inside lay the remnants of gas masks, their rubber cracked and brittle, the glass of their eyepieces clouded with time. Beneath them were small tins labeled faintly in block letters, perhaps food rations or medical supplies, their surfaces corroded beyond recognition. Marcus lifted one mask carefully, holding it up to the light, and the absurdity of it struck him. Here, beneath his backyard, lay the tools of survival from a world that had once believed destruction was imminent. He moved deeper into the chamber, each discovery feeding his determination. Against another wall, he found a metal cabinet, its door ajar, revealing binders swollen with damp. He pulled one free, the paper inside fragile and spotted with mold. He turned the pages cautiously, his light catching glimpses of typed words, diagrams, lists of materials. Though much of it was illegible, the headings were clear. Emergency procedures, evacuation protocol, radiation preparedness. He felt a chill that had nothing to do with the underground air. This was no fantasy or imagined relic. This was a nuclear shelter, built for a time when the world teetered on the edge of catastrophe. The realization settled heavily on him. He pictured the families who might have stood here, huddled together in fear, waiting for a siren or an explosion that, thankfully, never came. He imagined the builders lowering materials into the earth, sealing away not only supplies but a fragment of human hope and terror. And now, decades later, he alone had returned, the first to breathe this stale air, the first to see the echoes of lives that had prepared for the unthinkable. Marcus sat on the cracked floor, his flashlight resting beside him, and let the truth wash over him. The garden he had envisioned was gone now, replaced by something far more extraordinary. The soil he had meant to turn for tomatoes had instead yielded history, a forgotten capsule of a time when the world believed it might end in fire. He knew his life had changed irrevocably in that moment, though he could not yet see how far the ripples would spread. For now there was only the chamber, the silence, and the weight of discovery pressing down from all sides. He lingered until the beam of his flashlight began to dim, the batteries draining with the hours he had spent wandering. Reluctantly, he made his way back to the spiral staircase, his footsteps echoing in the cavern. As he climbed, the groan of the rusted steps seemed louder, more insistent, as though warning him that the path was fragile and could not bear too much weight. When at last he emerged into the sunlight, blinking against its brilliance, the air felt sharp in his lungs. He closed the hatch carefully, sealing the darkness below once more, but his mind was already racing ahead. He would return, better prepared, with more light, perhaps even help. He had seen only the first hints of what lay hidden, and he knew instinctively that there was more, much more, waiting to be uncovered. That night, lying awake in his bed, Marcus stared at the ceiling as he replayed every moment. The hatch, the descent, the chamber filled with relics of fear and survival. It was no longer a question of whether he would return. The only question was when. The underground had revealed its secrets to him once, and he knew it would call him back until he had uncovered them all. Marcus had not slept much after that first descent, but when the morning came he felt no fatigue, only an anxious urgency that carried him outside before the sun was fully risen. The hatch, now cleaned of most of the soil that had hidden it, looked less like a random object and more like an intentional entrance. The sight of it in the yard filled him with a mixture of dread and exhilaration. He thought back to what he had seen the day before: the spiral staircase groaning under his weight, the dome-shaped chamber, the crates with their crumbling gas masks, the faded posters on the walls, and realized that he had only scratched the surface of what this place could hold. He knew that if he wanted to explore further, he would need to be better prepared. The flashlight had already dimmed the last time, and if it had died completely while he was underground, the thought of being trapped in darkness was unbearable. That morning, he drove into town, buying extra batteries, another flashlight, a small camping lantern, and heavy gloves. He also picked up a notebook, telling himself he would write down everything he found, not only to keep track, but to make sense of it later. By the time he returned home, the heat of midday had settled over the desert, but Marcus could not wait. He drank deeply from a jug of water, adjusted the strap of his bag, and opened the hatch once more. The rush of stale air greeted him again, though it seemed less sharp now, as though the underground was exhaling slowly after decades of silence. He lowered himself onto the staircase, testing each step with care, his light casting long shadows against the walls. The climb down felt easier this time, less uncertain, though the sense of danger still lingered in every creak of metal beneath his boots. When at last he reached the chamber, the lantern illuminated it more fully than before, spilling light into corners that had been swallowed by darkness. It was then that he saw more clearly how carefully the place had been designed. The walls were thick concrete, lined in places with metal beams for reinforcement. Though the fiberglass panels on the ceiling were cracked, the dome structure remained intact, a testament to the builder's skill. Along one side of the room stood a row of lockers, their doors rusted shut. Marcus pried one open with the iron bar, the hinges screeching in protest, and inside he found more remnants of another time. Uniforms folded stiff with age, boots crumbling at the seams, and helmets with straps that snapped at his touch. The insignia on the uniforms was too faded to decipher, but the shapes were unmistakably military. He opened another locker and his stomach tightened. Inside were stacks of notebooks, their pages swollen and fragile. He lifted one carefully, brushing away dust, and began to turn the pages. The handwriting inside was neat, blocky, written in black ink that had bled faintly over time. Dates marked the top of each page, 1961, 1962, and beneath them were lists, schedules, even personal notes. He read fragments that made his pulse quicken. Tested filters, still functional. Report received from above ground. Tensions increasing. Families uneasy. Supplies sufficient for now. These were not the musings of an ordinary citizen. This was the voice of someone assigned to watch, to record, to survive in a world that had once stood on the brink of destruction. Marcus set the notebook aside and moved further, his lantern casting a glow across the floor where footprints still lingered in the dust, faint but visible. He knelt to touch them, and the reality struck him more deeply than any relic. People had lived here. People had walked this very floor, waiting for the world to collapse above them. He felt the weight of their silence, the way their fears seemed to hang in the air even decades later. Against the far wall stood a desk, its wood warped but still upright. On top of it lay a stack of folders sealed with brittle string. Marcus untied one and opened it, his eyes scanning the typed pages within. The words blurred together at first, the official tone dry and clinical, but then certain phrases leapt out at him. Containment, protocol, alpha, unauthorized experiments. His hands trembled as he turned the pages, the lantern's light flickering against the walls. These were not merely survival instructions. They hinted at something deeper, something hidden beneath the guise of safety. The equipment in the chamber supported his suspicion. He had expected storage for food or water, but instead he found strange devices. Metal boxes with dials and meters, their labels worn away, cables coiled like snakes across the floor. One machine resembled a radio, but its components were far more complex, with switches and markings he did not recognize. Another was a heavy cylinder, sealed tightly, its surface etched with numbers. He tapped it lightly and heard the hollow resonance within. The discovery unsettled him. This was not the simple shelter of a fearful family. It had been built with purpose, with funding, with a design that spoke of secrecy rather than mere survival. As he examined each object, Marcus could not shake the feeling that he had uncovered not just history, but a secret deliberately buried. He thought again of the previous owner of his house, of the way the property had been sold so quickly and cheaply. Had they known what was down here? Had they been warned not to disturb it? Or had this place been forgotten even by those who once guarded it? Hours passed unnoticed as Marcus explored, jotting notes into his new notebook, sketching crude diagrams of the room, cataloging the relics he uncovered. The lantern flickered occasionally, reminding him of time slipping by, but he pressed on, driven by the need to understand. At last, exhaustion forced him to stop. He sat on the concrete floor, leaning against the cold wall, the gas mask he had pulled from the crate resting beside him. He stared into the dim light, trying to picture the faces of the men who had built this, the families who had once trusted it, the voices that had written the notes he now held in his bag. When he finally climbed back up the staircase and emerged into the night, the sky above him glittered with stars, vast and indifferent. He closed the hatch carefully, sealing away the chamber once again, but the knowledge of it pressed heavily on him. This was no ordinary shelter. It was part of a larger story, one that carried traces of experiments, of hidden agendas, of lives lived in shadows. And Marcus, a man who had only wanted peace and a garden, had now become the keeper of that secret. He lay in bed that night, unable to sleep, his mind turning over the documents he had read, the machines he had touched. The more he thought about it, the more he felt certain that the shelter beneath his yard was more than just a relic of fear. It was a piece of history that had never been meant to see the light of day. He was caught now between fear of what it might mean and the undeniable need to uncover more. The voices of the past, silent though they were, seemed to whisper to him still, urging him back into the depths. The days that followed blurred together as Marcus slipped into a rhythm he had never expected for himself. Each morning he rose, drank a quick cup of coffee, and went outside to lift the hatch, lowering himself into the underground chamber with the same mixture of apprehension and exhilaration. He spent hours cataloging everything he could find, filling his notebook with sketches and observations, trying to piece together the fragments of another era. The more he read of the notebooks and folders he had discovered, the clearer it became that this was no ordinary fallout shelter. The documents hinted at government involvement, at testing of equipment, at strategies for survival that went beyond storing canned food and clean water. There were references to procedures that made little sense to him, words like containment drills and classified assignments. The machines left behind were unlike anything he had seen, not the crude radios or basic supplies one might expect, but something more specialized, more deliberate. He felt as though he had become the custodian of something larger than himself, though he did not yet know whether that was a blessing or a burden. At night, he would sit on his porch, staring into the desert horizon, the stars wheeling overhead, and wonder what he was supposed to do with this knowledge. The world outside moved on as always, cars humming along distant roads, neighbors tending to their chores, while he carried a secret beneath his feet that could change everything. It was a strange, lonely feeling, one that settled into his bones like a weight he could not put down. It might have remained his secret for longer if not for a conversation overheard by accident. One afternoon, while standing in line at the small grocery store in town, he heard two men talking about how quiet his property had been for so long, how quickly it had sold when the previous owner decided to move. One of them mentioned rumors, half in jest, about something strange buried in that yard, a story that had drifted through the town for decades but had never been proven. Marcus stood frozen, clutching a loaf of bread, realizing in that instant that he had not been the only one to hear whispers. The difference was that he had found proof. That night, restless and unsettled, he wrote in his notebook not just about the shelter, but about the responsibility he felt. If people in town had already speculated, if rumors had existed long before him, then perhaps what he had uncovered belonged to more than just his backyard. The thought terrified him because it meant the secret could not stay sealed forever. He considered telling no one, burying it again, but already he knew that such a choice was impossible. The shelter demanded to be known. The first person he confided in was a neighbor named Carl, a man in his 50s who often waved to Marcus when they crossed paths near the property line. One evening, when the sun was sinking low and the desert air grew softer, Marcus mentioned that he had been digging in the yard and found something unusual. Carl laughed, assuming it was another broken pipe or a relic of the old septic system, but when Marcus explained further and offered to show him, the man's amusement faded. Together they walked to the hatch, and when Marcus pulled it open, revealing the spiral staircase dropping into shadow, Carl let out a long whistle. Within days, word had spread farther than Marcus ever intended. Carl told his wife mentioned it to a friend, and soon others began asking Marcus what he had really found. At first, he brushed it off, unwilling to reveal too much, but curiosity is a hunger that feeds itself. Neighbors came by unannounced, standing in his yard and peering toward the patch of earth with expectant eyes. Some were skeptical, accusing him of exaggeration, while others seemed almost frightened, as though the very idea of something buried beneath their town unsettled them. Then came the journalists. A local paper caught wind of the story, and one afternoon a young reporter knocked on Marcus's door with a notebook in hand and questions spilling from her mouth. She asked if it was true that he had discovered a hidden bunker, if he had gone inside, if he had found anything of importance. Marcus hesitated, caught between the instinct to protect what he had uncovered and the realization that denying it would only make the story grow wilder. Against his better judgment, he allowed her to look, lowering her part way into the hatch so she could glimpse the chamber below. Her wide-eyed astonishment told him everything. This story would not stay small. The article appeared 2 days later, complete with photographs of the hatch and breathless descriptions of Marcus's discovery. Almost overnight, his quiet property became a point of fascination. Strangers began driving by, slowing their cars to catch a glimpse. Some stopped to knock on his door, asking for a tour, while others simply stood at the edge of the fence, whispering to one another as though they were standing before sacred ground. The peace Marcus had so desperately sought when he moved into the house was gone, replaced by the uneasy presence of eyes always watching. Not all the attention was welcome. Officials from the county appeared, clipboards in hand, asking questions about safety, about property rights, about whether he had the authority to disturb what might be considered historically significant. Their tone was polite, but edged with suspicion. One of them suggested that the government might need to take control of the site for further study, which made Marcus's chest tighten with panic. He had not asked for this responsibility, but the thought of losing the shelter to strangers who would strip it bare and lock it away filled him with dread. Friends he had not spoken to in years called after seeing the article online, their voices filled with excitement. Some suggested he could make money by charging admission, turning the shelter into a tourist attraction. Others urged him to keep it private, warning him of dangers he might not understand. Even strangers sent him letters, some offering help, others spinning theories about what the shelter really was. A government experiment, a secret military lab, a vault for weapons long forgotten. Each theory added to his unease, because though many were ridiculous, some sounded uncomfortably plausible. Through it all, Marcus felt himself changing. The man who had arrived at this house seeking quiet, seeking nothing more than a garden and a place to rest, was gone. In his place was someone burdened by discovery, pulled into a story that was bigger than he had ever imagined. He spent hours on the porch at night, staring at the hatch, wondering whether he had done the right thing in ever opening it. Yet, even in his doubt, he could not deny the pull. The shelter had been hidden for decades, but it had chosen him as the one to reveal it, and he could not turn away from that truth. The pressure mounted as weeks passed. More reporters came, cameras flashing, questions shouted. County officials returned, this time with stronger warnings about liability and danger. Neighbors debated among themselves whether the shelter was a blessing or a curse for the town. Marcus, caught in the center, felt himself stretch thin. He had unearthed history, but history had a way of demanding payment from those who disturbed it. And yet, in his quietest moments, when the world around him grew still, he felt a flicker of pride. Whatever this place was, however it had come to be buried beneath his yard, he had been the one to bring it back into the light. It was a heavy responsibility, but Marcus had carried heavy burdens all his life. Perhaps, he thought, this was simply another test, another weight to bear. He told himself he would not let outsiders strip the shelter of its meaning, nor allow it to be lost to bureaucracy. The story was his now, part of his life, and he would find a way to protect it. What he did not yet realize was that the choices he made next would determine not only the fate of the shelter, but the course of his own future, reshaping his life in ways he had never imagined. The clamor that had surrounded Marcus in the weeks after the article was published did not fade the way he hoped it might. Instead, it grew louder, reaching beyond his neighborhood and spilling into conversations in town and even further, as though the secret that had been buried beneath his backyard had taken on a life of its own. He found himself in the middle of something he had never asked for, caught between the pull of strangers who wanted to see the shelter with their own eyes and the push of officials who insisted it should be closed, documented, and removed from his care. Yet, beneath all the noise, Marcus felt something shifting inside him, a clarity forming where confusion had once reigned. He had discovered the shelter. He had breathed its stale air, read its forgotten words, and felt the weight of its silence. Whatever anyone else might say, the place belonged not to the government, not to opportunists, not even to the town at large, but to history itself. The pressure to decide what would become of the shelter grew unbearable. Neighbors came with advice and with pleas, some urging him to turn it into a tourist attraction to bring money into the town, others warning him of the dangers of letting too many people inside. Officials returned with clipped voices and veiled threats about safety violations and the risk of collapse, implying that they might have no choice but to seal it permanently. Reporters continued to appear on his porch, notebooks open, their questions sharp and eager, wanting to know what he would do. Marcus listened to them all, but when he sat alone on his porch at night, staring at the hatch under the desert stars, he realized that none of their voices could matter more than his own. He had found the shelter, he had seen what it held, and it was his responsibility to give it a purpose. The thought of turning it into a spectacle unsettled him deeply. He could not imagine cheap tickets and crowds of people trampling the dust of the chamber, snapping photographs while the gas masks and notebooks of another generation lay scattered at their feet. Nor could he bring himself to accept the idea of officials locking it away forever, stripping it of meaning and reducing it to a footnote in an archive. The shelter was more than that. It was a story of fear, of preparation, of survival, and of secrets that ordinary people were never meant to see. It deserved to be remembered with dignity, not hidden or sold. The decision came to him slowly but firmly. He would turn it into a place of memory, a kind of museum where people could stand in the silence and feel the weight of history pressing down upon them. He would restore what he could, make it safe enough to enter, and preserve it not as a curiosity, but as a reminder of what it meant to live in a world always bracing for the worst. If the past had been buried in his backyard, then perhaps it was his task to ensure it was not buried again. With that choice made, Marcus set about the work. He reached out to the few neighbors who had shown him kindness, asking for help in clearing debris, shoring up the staircase, and sealing the cracks in the concrete. To his surprise, they agreed, some out of curiosity, others out of respect for what he was trying to do. Together, they spent long hours under the desert sun, mixing new cement, lifting heavy beams, and reinforcing the entrance so that it would no longer threaten to collapse. Marcus handled each task with a seriousness that came not only from caution, but from reverence. He was not just repairing a structure, he was preserving a story. Inside, he worked carefully to restore order. He cleaned the crates and arranged their contents, lining up the brittle masks and tins on shelves he built himself. He set aside the notebooks and folders, drying them gently and placing them in protective cases to prevent further decay. The machines, those strange and complex devices with their dials and wires, he cleaned and polished as best he could, their mysteries unsolved but their presence undeniable. Piece by piece, the shelter began to resemble less a forgotten ruin and more a place of testimony, a space where the past could breathe again. The first visitors he allowed inside were not reporters or officials, but neighbors. He led them down the spiral staircase with lanterns in hand, watching their faces as they entered the chamber for the first time. Their expressions shifted from skepticism to awe, the weight of the silence settling on their shoulders just as it had on his. Some whispered, others simply stared. One elderly woman touched the edge of a gas mask with trembling fingers and said nothing at all. Marcus knew then that his choice had been right. This was not just his discovery. It belonged to everyone willing to bear witness. Of course, not everyone approved. Officials continued to press him, warning of liability, threatening legal action, hinting that the shelter might be claimed under state authority. Marcus stood firm. He explained that the work he had done was for preservation, not profit, and that to strip it from him would be to bury history once again. He argued, calmly but insistently, that the shelter was a relic of the Cold War, a piece of their collective story, and that it should not be hidden behind locked doors or turned into a curiosity for tourists. His persistence, combined with the growing support of townspeople who had visited and been moved, eventually forced the officials to back down, though uneasily. Months passed, and the shelter took on new life. Marcus found donations trickling in, small at first, then more generous, as word spread that he was building a memorial. He used the funds to replace the fragile staircase with sturdier steps, to install proper lighting and ventilation, and to create displays that explained the context of what had been found. He studied history books late into the night, teaching himself about the years when the world teetered on the edge of nuclear war, so that he could explain to visitors not only what they were seeing, but why it had once mattered so deeply. In time, the shelter became known not just in his town, but beyond. Historians visited, offering their insight and confirming that what Marcus had found was rare, perhaps one of the most intact private bunkers of its era. Students came on field trips, listening wide-eyed as Marcus spoke of fear and hope, of preparation and secrecy. He never pretended to have all the answers. Instead, he invited them to stand in the silence, to look at the gas masks and notebooks, and to imagine the people who had once walked there, waiting for a catastrophe that thankfully never came. And through it all, Marcus changed as well. The man who had once sought only peace and solitude found himself standing at the center of a story far larger than his own life. He no longer felt like a laborer scraping by day to day, but like a custodian of memory, someone who had been entrusted with a fragment of history. It was a role he had not chosen, but one he accepted fully, with the same quiet determination that had guided him through every hardship. Sometimes, late at night, when the visitors had gone and the hatch was closed, Marcus would sit alone in the chamber, the lantern casting long shadows on the concrete walls. He would run his fingers over the rough notebooks, trace the outlines of machines whose purposes still eluded him, and feel the presence of those who had once built and used this place. In those moments, he knew that his garden had grown after all, not in rows of vegetables sprouting from the soil, but in something deeper, something that would outlast him. He had planted memory where there had once been silence, and it had taken root. The secret buried in his backyard had become his life's work, reshaping everything he had believed about himself. Where once he had been a man running from noise, seeking the quiet life of soil and seed, now he was the voice of a forgotten past, a bridge between what had been feared and what had survived. Marcus understood that the path ahead would not be simple, that there would always be arguments and doubts, but he no longer felt the urge to turn away. He had unearthed the past, and in doing so, had unearthed a new purpose for himself. When he looked back on the moment his shovel struck the metal plate, he realized that it had been more than chance. It had been the beginning of a story that had waited decades for someone stubborn enough to dig, curious enough to look deeper, and determined enough not to give up. The man who once thought of himself as ordinary had found something extraordinary, and in choosing to preserve it, he had stepped onto a new path entirely. He closed his eyes, hearing the silence of the shelter as though it were breathing with him, and smiled. His life would never be the same again. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss our next unbelievable story. Click now to watch the next video. It's even more shocking than this one. Check out our other videos for more mysteries you won't believe are real. And share this video with your friends. Let them be stunned just like you were.